Hello and welcome to the Neuroscience channel. Today we are joined by Dr. Camilla Nord, who really is at the leading edge of mental health research. Dr. Nord runs her own programme at the University of Cambridge, and in this interview shares her thoughts on how in the future it will be possible to tailor treatments for individual patients. What I enjoyed most of all about the conversation with Dr. Nord was to hear about her appreciation of inner body awareness, or interoception. And Dr. Nord has the suspicion that changes to interoceptive processes may be a common feature that's helping people to get better across different types of treatments. I'm sure you will enjoy this conversation, and please remember to subscribe to the Neuroscience channel for more information about inner body awareness and interoception research. Thank you. Good morning, Camilla. Thank you so much for joining us on the Neuroscience channel.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it is really nice to be speaking to someone in Cambridgeshire, even though we're still using Zoom. We're not too far away.
No, so, practically neighbours.
That's it. And even easier now that they've done a lot of work on the motorways between Peterborough and Cambridge. So it makes it much easier to travel across Cambridgeshire. So I can tell from your accent you're not from this neck of the woods. So can you give me a little bit of an introduction about your career background and how you ended up as a researcher at the University of Cambridge, investigating body-brain processes and their role in mental health conditions?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been in the UK a very long time, actually. So I moved to the UK when I was 18. And I have family here, but I'm actually from a few different places. So it's that's why I have an accent that sounds like I was dropped into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, although luckily I wasn't. So after moving to the UK, I did my undergraduate degree. I then moved to Queen Square, which is a place in London surrounded by neurology and neurosurgery hospitals and research centres. And it was there that I really became interested in neuroscience as a research topic. It was actually the patients that I got to see whilst working there, patients who suffered from very complex disorders that didn't quite fall into neurology and didn't quite fall into psychiatry, that made me think about what kind of what lay ahead for brain science in terms of explaining our experience of the body and our experience of symptoms in the body, and the crucial role of the brain systems in that, in really every single medical disorder. So nothing we experience is some kind of direct transmission from the body. It's, of course, our subjective interpretation. And that realization led me to want to do a PhD and pursue further research in this area. So after a year where I worked as a research assistant, applied for PhD funding because it's very competitive. So managed to get on a PhD place also in Queen Square. Worked in a few different labs before, in a sort of rotation system before settling. I did a PhD focusing on a region of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is there, in depression. And I worked it was very interdisciplinary. So I'm a neuroscientist and I do things like brain scans and brain stimulation, these sort of exotic approaches, but I worked with a team of clinical psychologists who do therapy in a way to try to enhance the effects of what they were doing using neuroscientific approaches. And that really excited me, this idea that my research area could work at the kind of edge of new treatment innovation. And that's what I've focused on since then. So 4.5 years ago, I then moved to Cambridge initially as a postdoc, and now I run my own lab here. And in my lab, we're very interested in exploiting these new innovations in neuroscience for mental health treatment. And I use mental health in the broadest sense because we're also very interested in physical health.
I'm really keen to find out more about some of the techniques you use and how your research has evolved, and how you're now kind of looking at something called interoception, which is what we focus on this channel. But first of all, I'm really curious, and I ask most people who come on to this channel a question: how has what you've learned, during your research, helped you in your own life, or changed the way that you understand human behavior for you personally?
I think the biggest way that my research has affected my life, and really my spouse would attest to this because it's incredibly annoying, is that when I experience physical symptoms, and it might be, for example, I had quite a dramatic reaction to my first vaccine. I had a very high fever and I was in bed for a couple of days, or following some other kind of physical symptoms. I'm always incredibly cautious about attributing those physical symptoms to a purely physical cause because of the research that I do. And I know that they're essentially undifferentiable. When you experience physical symptoms, you actually don't know where the symptoms are coming from. We don't have special insight into whether it is entirely a virus or our own subjective reaction to the virus that's causing the symptoms. So as a result, I'm really annoying when I'm ill because I sort of have this hesitation in attributing my symptoms to an entirely physical cause, just because it's what I study and I know how common that kind of the origin of physical symptoms from the brain are. So I'm that's the way it's affected me.
So if someone says, "Oh, it must have been something you ate," when you get a stomach bug, you sort of say, "Well, maybe."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So how did it turn out with your the reaction? You were laid in bed with a fever. What was going through your mind then? What specific questions?
I was very interested because some of my research is about the effects of stress on the immune system. It's very easy to think that if you're having an immune reaction, if you have objective measures of inflammation, something like a fever, that it must be entirely your peripheral physiology that's causing it. But I know from my work that in some cases, something like stress can cause this physical immune reaction. And oftentimes, and probably something like vaccine side effects are an example of this, oftentimes it's both. Some of your symptoms are caused by the actual actions of a vaccine, let's say, and some of your symptoms are caused by your own subjective interpretations of those actions. So it could be, for example, that you're experiencing fever as a result of the vaccine, but that you're experiencing, immense fatigue or cognitive difficulties, and those could have more of an effect from your expectations about your body, expectations about the world. So it might not fall as neatly along some symptoms in one category, some symptoms in another, though in big trials, it does sometimes turn out that way. So in post-vaccine side effects, many of them happen in placebo vaccines as well, but fever a lot less. So that's one that tends to differentiate between the two. Something like headache, just as much.
Got to experience firsthand the power of possible, combination of all this stress and tiredness and expectations around the vaccine.
It was particularly punitive, by the way, because I got my first vaccine a little bit early for my age group because I'd been doing the vaccinating. So I had spent all day telling people what the side effects were, that they weren't that bad, take a paracetamol. And then when I experienced them myself, it was not fun.
Oh, okay. And then what about the follow-on, the second dose and the boosters? Did you?
I was fine. Yeah,
you were fine.
I was totally fine. Which is quite common for AstraZeneca, which is what I had.
Okay, so you explained that you've some of your work, and especially in the past, has been very close to patients, and then you're doing all this kind of techniques to study the brain at the same time. What kind of techniques? So for people who are not familiar with cognitive science and neuroscience techniques, how do you observe what's going on in someone's head?
Well, when you want to know what's going on in someone's head, you really have a big choice to make. Either you can use these sort of more biological techniques. So ideally, you could measure the actions of brain cells, the actions of neurons. But the problem with doing that is that it's typically invasive. So whenever you see data that actually literally involves the actions of brain cells, it's usually in animals, in non-human animals, or occasionally in patients who are in the middle of surgery. So very, very rare population, very small numbers in whom you can get these kind of direct recordings. So we use proxies for brain activation. And in my type of neuroscience, in cognitive neuroscience, where we study humans, we typically use brain imaging techniques like MRI or functional MRI, which gives you some insight, in the case of functional MRI, into the actions of different parts of the brain. Normal MRI, it's just the structure, like the anatomy. So that's one of the primary ways that we link what's going on in the brain with behavior. One of the advantages, so that sounds until now like, well, why wouldn't you just use animals or these small groups of patients? The reason I like using humans is because it gets around the second thing that we do to understand the brain, which is ask someone. So one of the best ways to understand how someone is feeling and what they're perceiving and what they'd like to do is to ask them. And we can basically only do that in humans. We have to use very clever techniques to do that. In animals, and make some assumptions. So the best thing about doing this in humans is that you can get them to do very sophisticated human things, human thoughts, human behaviors, while measuring a decent proxy for brain activity.
Sorry, MRI is used for, you said, structural problems. So let's say someone had a bit of brain damage and you could notice a lesion or a scar or something in the brain or a blood clot. Whereas functional MRI, is that in real time? So you're looking at something like changes in blood flow or as exactly they do right. This task. So you can say to someone, can you look at something or speak about something or do a movement and then look for changes during the fMRI scan. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. All fMRI experiments are basically subtraction experiments. The subtraction of where in your brain is active when you're tapping your finger versus where in your brain is active when you're just lying there, maybe thinking about tapping your finger. So you kind of come up with these conditions of interest and control conditions, maybe looking at an emotional face versus looking at a neutral face. That's a very common one. Looking at a face versus a house. And all these subtractions will give you a different set of regions in the brain that are involved in computing that particular subtraction of interest.
Okay. I noticed looking down through some of your publications that you have been very thorough in trying to understand the use of fMRI and that you've looked at the reliability of these. So can you say a little bit about how you've tried to discern whether or not the technique itself is a reliable indicator?
Yes. So this has to do with what really is my ultimate goal in my research, which, like a number of researchers in my field, is to predict which treatment a patient should get when they first turn up to a doctor. So in the field of mental health, we don't have that kind of predictive ability right now. What we have is sort of a doctor's best guess. We don't have an algorithm for what treatment to give them. And some people have found, and some of my own work is in this field, but many other people as well, that activity in specific parts of the brain when you're doing specific tasks, like an emotion task, is predictive of whether you would be a good responder to, say, an antidepressant drug or a good responder to, say, cognitive behavioral therapy, so that brain activity might differentiate who should get one treatment over the other. Would be very useful if it were true. But what you would want for that to be true is to be able to scan someone's brain twice. And for them, if they had high activity in one bit of the brain called the amygdala today, they would still have relatively high activity tomorrow compared to a group of people. So the actual objective amount can change as long as everyone's changes over time. So that's the concept, this concept that if you're a high responder today, you're a high responder tomorrow. And then it would be useful to differentiate who should get what treatment. And I found that in these most common tasks that people use, in emotional tasks, actually the regions that have been suggested are not reliable. But it's a little bit of a mystery because they still are true. You can still find it when you run a new experiment. I've replicated some of the findings myself, that, for example, amygdala activation is related to treatment response. Yet still there is something about that measure that makes it potentially not ideal for uses in this context. It's called a biomarker. So for use as a biomarker. And that's what my my early research showed. So now what I do when I want to do this kind of predicting treatment outcome study is I measure that reliability as part of a trial design. So I actually later found that a different part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex in depression that I was telling you about, that region in the brain is reliable when you scan it more than once across days. So there are a few factors that could contribute to that, but that initial sort of reliability test is a good litmus test of what would be useful in a clinical context.
Okay, great. This has given me a really nice picture, actually, that the brain, if you just take a snapshot of a brain on any person's brain in one moment, you might see all kinds of fireworks happening, and you can't say that that's going to represent what they look like most of their life. So, I know my mood personally goes up and down, my emotions and feelings change throughout the day. And it's what you're saying that, if you scanned me several days in a row, you would want to find something in the brain that gives you an indication of my average mood, rather than just jump into conclusions and saying that, oh, this little part of my brain's fired off, so Ian must be a happy person or a sad person.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's actually a big issue in my field, because often, just because of the constraints of how an experiment works, you measure someone in a single shot way, and then you say people with depression differ on this particular brain measure, but it's just a snapshot. And what you need is either a snapshot that is so good it describes something more general, despite the various changes in the day, which is something sort of that many of us are working towards. But an alternative that some people are keen on is actually moving away from the snapshot approach and measuring people throughout the day. This is tough with brain scans, but it's possible with things like smartphones. So some of the big developments in my field have been that we can measure people's cognition, mood, behavior throughout the day using smartphone apps. And that might give you a fuller picture. As you say, all of us have these patterned changes in our mood and our emotions. And that pattern itself might be a better clue than a really good snapshot.
Yeah. I can see with things like Fitbit and apps for measuring sleep and wearable devices that we're on the kind of brink of something potentially quite big if they are valid and reliable tools, these wearable devices. Okay, so are these apps then, are they using heart rate variability, or is there some kind of plug-in that actually measures brain activity that you're talking about?
I've seen a few different things. So what I was talking about is apps where you essentially play a game, a memory game, maybe a gambling game. And those games we then can analyze, and we know what bits of the brain are involved in that game. And potentially we have an understanding of how behavior on that game relates to clinical outcome. So this is often data that involves lots and lots of people. So you get maybe 1 million people in one particularly good app that I'm thinking about to do a particular task, a memory task, a navigation task, and then you track how this relates to changes in various clinical symptoms. And what it could do is, in future, it could give you a kind of demarcation of when someone would need clinical help, potentially, who's at risk, who would need a boost in some domain or another based on these apps.
Oh, fascinating. So it's not so much of change in their physiology, it's more their behavior, or their...
I would say the physiology is still coming in this domain. So they've often been considered very separately. There are kind of health apps that are more interested in physiology, and there are these mental health apps that are more interested in symptoms and behavior. Now, what I would like to do going forward is to integrate these two types of information and get things like heart rate throughout the day, as well as things like behavior and cognition throughout the day. But there are lots of tricky aspects of integrating the two. So I think it's going to take me a few years, but that's exactly what I'd like to do.
Fascinating. I hadn't thought about that kind of games or tracking behavior. I guess compliance would be an issue. How do you get people to regularly do the task or the activity
Yes.
that would be.
That's right. It's a big issue. So people have gotten around it by making the tasks as fun as possible, sort of gamifying them, and do get pretty good compliance. We often get around it by paying people for experimental purposes. If they worked, I think people would do it if they found it helpful, if they thought, well, I do this game, once a week, and it kind of gives me some indication of some other useful thing in my life. People do use lots of apps regularly, kind of period tracking apps, etc. So if this could be sort of new insight that people would find helpful for their everyday life, then that would, I think, incentivize people. But of course, it is an issue. Lots of people download apps and then never or rarely use them.
Well, I'll look forward to finding out more about that. That's given me a really nice overview of, the breadth of your work. I saw an article you wrote online. That's what led me to contact you for Psyche on interoception, which is something I'm particularly interested in. And in the article, you explained your reason for doing a big kind of analysis of some previously collected brain scan data that was focused on interoception. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that and what the surprising things you learned that helped you to discover some commonalities between patients with different mental health conditions?
Yes, absolutely. So interoception, I agree with you, such a fascinating field. What interoception is our brain's awareness, our brain and ourselves awareness of the physiological condition of our body. So hunger, that's interoception. And lots of different measures of interoception have been used in the literature, and in lots of cases have been found to be disrupted in different mental health and physical health conditions. So to give you an example of one of the best known results, our awareness of our heartbeat seems to vary in accordance with anxiety and autism symptoms in a number of different studies. So that's cardiovascular interoception, awareness of our cardiovascular system. In other studies, awareness of our gastric system is different in, for example, depression or in eating disorders. So all of these studies took very kind of, narrow but deep approaches to interoception, single disorder, single type of interoception. And I wanted to kind of flip that on its head and take a broad perspective on interoception. So I looked across all these different types of interoception and all these different patient groups, restricting it to psychiatric mental health disorders. You didn't have to meet criteria for a disorder, but you had to sort of be at the upper end of various scales or have a diagnosis. Those were the inclusion criteria. And what I did was I looked to see if there was anywhere in the brain that was different across all these conditions when patients were doing interoception. And you could imagine that when you look at individual groups of studies, lots of bits light up. There are lots of different areas involved in interoception and different in patients. But there was actually only one region that was commonly disrupted across all these different clinical groups and across all these interoception conditions. And that was a region called the mid-insula. It had different activity during interoception than in patients and in healthy controls.
Okay. Fascinating. So just to kind of check I've understood the background to the study. So this is all data that other scientists have done elsewhere, and it's been stored on a kind of open access free database. Is that right?
We're not that organized.
Oh.
Some has, some I found through digging through the original publications. Some I got by authors when I emailed them. They kindly sent me the data. Some of them sent me kind of raw data, and I did that initial analysis. There was kind of, lots of different routes to getting enough data. In the end, it was about 1,200 people, though. So that's the advantage. I couldn't scan that many people myself. I don't have enough time. Doing this.
So a lot of work to reach out and gather the data, and then obviously the analysis. Fab. So you discovered that there was the mid-insula. Now, that might not mean much for some people. So the way I view this is that, we've got the brain with all the different neurons, and there's certain areas that specialize or have, they receive information from our different senses. So it might be from our eyes or ears or from our heart or guts. And that has to get kind of, it's a little bit like a telephone network. And the brain has to kind of sort of process that by saying, okay, I've got a bit of information from here, bit of information here, and how do I make sense of this, and what meaning do I create? So is there, what can you may not know the answer, but what can you guess about the mid-insula from this? I know you talked about, it's near to the anterior, the bit in front of it and behind it. What's happening on beyond them? What's kind of converging at the mid-insula?
So, yeah, I think that's a fine description of what different bits of the brain do. I think there is an older concept of the brain where we have sort of one bit for everything, a bit for vision, a bit for audition, etc. And that is true in some domains. The insula is not a domain like that. It does a lot of different things. It doesn't have one function. And in fact, even those regions in the kind of older model of the brain really work quite differently depending on which other bits are active at the same time. So it's really much more of a network mapping to function rather than region mapping to function. So in the case of the insula, it's a biggish region. It's kind of located just there under the outside of the brain. It means island. And it's quite notable when you look at an MRI scan, if you kind of click through, so this MRI scan goes in slices. So if you click through from the outside of the brain, you can see when the insula starts to emerge, it looks like a little island, which is why it's named that. And from the rest of our body come these signals, these peripheral signals about what's going on in our gut, in our heart, in our lungs, etc. And they arrive in the brain in more like brainstem regions, and they get projected upward to the insula. So the insula takes in this information, especially in the back of the insula, the posterior insula, and then it begins to integrate this information. This is what's thought, that it integrates into a kind of state of the body, interoception, of what's going on, although there are other regions that are also involved in kind of computing that, but it's one of the major regions in computing that. But then it sends that information forward, potentially to help us make predictions about the body, which can then get sent back in a kind of cycle of when we make a prediction error, when we think the body is going to respond in a certain way, but it doesn't, then somewhere like the insula seems to be computing that and helping us learn about that for the future.
Okay, so so it's not just receiving information from the body and then creating an action. It's matching it with these prior beliefs or memories, and then seeing, the word error there is quite an important one, from what I understand of the latest sort of ideas of predictive coding or Bayesian brain models, that we're not so much a kind of stimulus response machine, but more of a prediction and correction machine.
Yes, that is a kind of a very popular conception of the brain, and one that I loosely subscribe to. I think one of the most important aspects of that is that our perception of the world, including the world of our internal body, is heavily influenced by our expectations. And that means that when we experience something, it's a mix of external input and expectations. It's also why things like visual illusions happen. When you think you're seeing something, but actually it's something different, that's an effect of your expectations on your vision. So this is the same, just with the body.
Mm-hmm. And is the idea that these expectations are there to help us? So, we watch weather forecasts so that they can help us decide the best clothes to wear or whether to go out or not at all. Is that the idea, that the brain is constantly trying to forecast so that it saves us time and energy?
Yes, it saves us time and energy, but it also makes us better, because often the input from the outside world, both vision, audition, and also the inside world, is really noisy. It can mean all kinds of different things. We're actually, quite poor at extracting that precise information. So often the best and most accurate way we can do it most of the time is to have learned from past experiences what that thing that we're seeing is, and then use that to influence what we're seeing when there's a little bit of ambiguity.
So what do you think's happening in the mid-insula then? Is that where some of this, the expectations are meeting? Is that where the actual decision making is going in terms of bodily signals and prior beliefs? Do you think that's where
potentially it's one region that is doing that. So my hypothesis is that the insula may be computing a difference between what we're expecting and what our body is experiencing. Now, this may be computed in multiple regions. What might be special about the mid-insula is that it's somewhere that's doing it a little bit aberrantly in different psychiatric disorders, so a little bit disrupted. And this could be in some disorders because beliefs and expectations about the body are disrupted, but it could also be in other disorders that the actual input from the body is somehow off. It's genuinely being, the information that's being communicated is itself disrupted. So that could mean that problems from multiple sources, not just expectations and not just problems in the body, could all result in disruptions in this kind of error processing system. And so that's why I hypothesized that's what the mid-insula could be doing, but we haven't proven that yet. So I'm working on that right now.
Yeah, that really does make sense that we can't just assume that because there's some different activity that the fault is there. That you hear about. I know vagus nerve stimulation has become very popular, and now the NHS, I believe, prescribes some battery-powered vagus nerve stimulators to put on the neck, and that's kind of assuming that the problem is with with poor signals from the vagus nerve, whereas it might be something in the insula, it might be down in the gut, I guess.
Yes, that's right. And it might depend on the person as well. Which is more and more my belief in this field. So there's been a movement during the last decade in particular away from the idea that people with depression, say, have one biological cause or driver, and towards the idea that there are these multiple causes that can contribute to multiple different types of disorders, including physical disorders, I should say, and that perhaps our kind of treatment innovation needs to be targeting specific, like endophenotypes, they're called, things that span multiple conditions, rather than kind of the specific tick box criteria of one diagnosis.
So endophenotype, I haven't heard of that before. So is that kind of a way of saying trying to get to the root cause of something in terms of the person's, unique? Is that not necessarily just physiology? It's
not necessarily. So the word endophenotype means it can sometimes be thought of as a kind of common risk factor, a common, phenotype is sort of a characteristic of the body and the brain, and cognition. And so it could be something like hypersensitivity to rewards in your environment. That could be considered an endophenotype. The phrase that you might encounter more than that one is transdiagnostic. The idea that there are certain factors that span diagnoses, and that's what the mid-insula is an example of in my study. It's a transdiagnostic disruption, but in other studies, it could be something like childhood maltreatment. That's a transdiagnostic risk factor. That's not specific to particular disorders, but it increases your risk of various disorders in the future. And the things that it affects in the brain are common. It's not like if it affects your amygdala, then you get depression. If it affects your prefrontal cortex, then you get anxiety. No, there are these kind of common biological mechanisms put in place by physical and environmental stressors. And those work across diagnostic categories.
So that's really given us a great picture and flavour of what's going on in terms of interoception and the insula. Another paper of yours that caught my attention was it had a title, "The Causal Role for Gastric Rhythm in Human Disgust Avoidance." So I think I was attracted to that because it used the word gastric, which is all about, our digestive system, and then this idea of disgust avoidance, which is our behaviour. So first of all, what is disgust from a sort of scientific point of view? And what did you learn about the role of our stomach or digestive system rhythm in disgust for this study?
Well, disgust does something very interesting to our physiological systems in the body. If we see something sort of viscerally disgusting, something that makes you go, ugh, let's imagine, vomit, feces. What happens is the rhythm of our stomach's contractions is disrupted. So normally our stomach contracts at a very regular rate, very slowly, about 3 times per minute, with the slow muscles in it. But if we see something disgusting, that rhythm is disrupted. It can speed up or slow down. Usually it speeds up, slightly depends. But that kind of disrupted rhythm is what happens if you vomit. But it also happens even if you don't vomit, just from seeing something viscerally disgusting. An interesting thing to note is that we, as in our language, we use the word disgust to refer to a bunch of different things. So that phenomenon that I've described, it's actually only a subset of disgusting things that give you that gastric blah. There's a huge other set of things that we call disgusting, but they're actually kind of fearful. So things like injuries, they sort of maybe feel disgusting, but actually they tend to be mediated by our cardiovascular system. They cause changes in our heart rate, among other things, and not necessarily our stomach. So physiologically, you can think of disgust as multiple things, even though we use it to mean one thing.
That's a really great example of something when, a situation when we use words to try and help, two people use words to try and help communicate with each other, but they could actually be trying to convey something very different. So if I always say disgusting whenever I feel unsettled in my body, one person might associate that with heart rhythm, and the other person might, have this nauseous feeling of stomach. And it's quite a different bodily reactions that those two people might be talking about, but they're using the same word.
Yes, that's exactly right. And, what we experience is really what we attribute our physiological activity to. So it's not that those people are experiencing the same thing, but describing it differently. They are genuinely having different experiences because they're attributing their internal physiological state differently. So if your heart's beating very quickly, you might attribute it to excitement, you might attribute it to fear, and whichever one your brain chooses is going to dictate how you feel.
And that's what I think is so great about your work, and what I'm learning about it today is that you're trying to almost personalize or get better granularity on what's going on with people with different mental health conditions. And, from when I speak to my clients and patients, I often hear, or we talk about anxiety as if it was one thing, but actually it can be a whole range of different bodily reactions or cognitive reactions to many different things. So it seems that the way that we view mental health will possibly change with the research that you're doing.
Well, thank you. I don't know if it will be entirely because of me, but I agree with you that the way we view mental health will change, is changing as we speak, via influences from this domain, the idea that there's no one anxiety.
I get the impression that these experiments take a long time, each of them, in terms of, I know fundraising, getting funding can take a long time, from the idea of the conception to the experiment, and then getting the funding, and then actually beginning the research and all the studies, and then it can take several years. What on the horizon for your lab at the moment? What things are you excited about?
Well, the thing I'm most excited about, because it represents the kind of culmination of the process you've described, where I spent years trying to convince people to give me funding, and then finally got it, and then finally ran it, and then managed to kind of get these very exciting findings. So what happened there was I had this idea that really brought together two very disparate fields. One field is the field of clinical psychology, people who are treating patients with therapeutic techniques using various different CBT, things like that. And the other is the field of what's called computational psychiatry, which is a field where sometimes people do a task like a computer game, and then we use mathematical models to extract numbers like how sensitive was that person to rewards, how sensitive was that person to punishments, how well did they learn over the task, things like that. Can be extracted from your behavior and what you choose in a task. So these fields have long been very, very separate and not necessarily spoken to one another. But I had this idea that if we got people to do one of those little computer games like we use in computational psychiatry while practicing a therapeutic technique, that could give us insight into what happens in the brain during therapy. So that's what I eventually managed to convince a funding body, AXA, who funded me for this fellowship, to do. So we got a lot of participants via an online sample. So people did this at home on their own computer screens. So we recruited about 1,000 using a website called Prolific, where people can sign up to do experiments on it. And in half of the participants, we trained them, or I recorded a little video training them on how to do something called cognitive distancing, which is an important component of therapy, mindfulness therapies, cognitive therapies, where you take a step back from your emotional reactions to a situation. And we said, try to do this throughout the computer game, where you're always getting feedback for the choices you make. Wrong choice, right choice, wrong choice, right choice, sorry, no points, you win some points, no points, etc. Every time you get that feedback, try to do this therapeutic technique. And what we found was that in the 500-ish participants who were doing that technique, they learned better. Overall, they did better at the task. And specifically, that was because they learned better from getting negative feedback. So every time they were told that their answer was wrong, they integrated that better into their understanding of the task to make a better choice the next time, which is very interesting. And it gives insight into how in therapy, people might not just start ignoring bad things in their life, because we've all got bad things in our life, but they might be better able to learn from them, to kind of rationally and from a distance understand them and make a better choice the next time.
Is the stepping back a kind of not dissociating, but taking a broader view and not reacting so emotionally in the moment?
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Well, not only was that what we hoped people would do, that was actually what we saw they did in their behavior, that they were able to actually take a broader view of the game itself, because we found in our computational modeling that they could integrate the values of the values of these choices that they make throughout the task a little bit better. It's quite a simple task where people are choosing between symbols that they've never seen before and seeing which symbols result in winning a little bit of money. So it's a kind of very, very trivial thing, but that represents these broader decisions that we make throughout life in terms of what things to approach and try to get, what's good in the world, and what we should avoid, what's actually bad and wouldn't win us any points.
Mm-hmm. And were they, before they were given the training on distancing themselves from the activity, did you collect some baseline data for how they normally behave doing that task, or did they dive straight in with
It's interesting that you asked that. That was actually how I initially wanted to do the experiment. But in a couple of years ago, when I started piloting this, it's called, you do it in smaller samples in person and you get feedback from people on the task. What I found was that actually this task was a kind of good single shot experiment, but if you did it more than once, all of a sudden there were different things that happened because you'd already done it. So whilst that design in a way would have been the best, because of the things we were measuring, actually it turned out not to be the best. So that's why we had half of them do it and half of them not. But ideally, yes, a before and after would be the best. What we could do, what I'd like to do really, is do this in a clinical context where you can then obviously look at people and their decisions before something like therapy and after. But we weren't able to do it sort of like one after the other.
This is great stuff. And I think that I love the idea that you are trying to combine those two different worlds of existing therapies with this kind of really in-depth analysis of what's going on in the brain. And because I see that, you know, from the world I'm in with lots of, you know, being surrounded by different therapists doing different techniques, there seems so much scope for understanding the common features of all these different techniques with different brand names and so on. So it'd be lovely to see, to get a kind of common understanding of what's really happening and what are the essential core features of all these different therapies. And, you know, my gut feeling, and this is my bias, is that interoception is part of that, is just as important as the cognitive aspects of different therapies.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And, you know, although that particular experiment didn't involve explicit interoception, actually what people are doing is they're getting gut feelings about which of these choices is the best one. You know, you can't actually really ask someone how they did it. They're just sort of liking some of them more than others as the experiment goes on. And those kind of gut feelings, that really does arise from the state of our body. And I do think there's a kind of interoceptive component, both with distancing in general, but also with kind of the decisions that we're making in everyday life.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation so far. I'm aware we're coming up to an hour. So do you have anything else to share? Any kind of hopes or visions or things that you think people might be useful for people to know about?
Well, I think what you just said about the role of interoception across different treatments is probably a theme that I would really like to explore going forward. I've been thinking quite a lot about what is in common between different treatments that work in different people, because although we're all different and we sort of respond well to different things, there might be a kind of common route of success that you can just access from different avenues. And I do think that in a number of people, one of those routes is interoceptive. So what I would really love to do going forward, pending all that funding convincing that you were talking about, is to look at the commonalities of interoceptive changes across different therapeutic approaches. That, to me, would be really, really exciting and give us some insight into how people get better. And then in future, what we could do to boost that.
Well, that's great news to hear that from you, from my biased point of view. But I've also been really, you know, I discovered Audible at the end of last year, and I've listened to quite a few books from different cognitive neuroscientists, Antonio Damasio, Anil Seth, Mark Solms. And it seems like, you know, the tide is turning a little bit on the feeling aspect of our existence, and more. Maybe I'm just selecting out those scientists and authors who have that opinion, but it does seem like there's a bit of a groundswell of trying to.
I agree. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the expectation effect as well, because I'm very lucky to be writing a book at the moment. Maybe one day you will get to listen to it on Audible. So it will hopefully come out in about a year. It's due to Penguin in September. So that's apparently 6 month kind of time after that is normal. And what I'm really hoping, or what I've kind of drafted thus far, is a book that goes across the interoceptive ideas that we've talked about in the broadest sense. How do we construct our own well-being and mental health about the world? Where does that come from? And where I think it comes from are expectations and beliefs. And so I'm interested, you know, in my book, in communicating this idea of our expectations about the world, the outside world and the inside world, and how we use that to construct feeling mentally healthy or less healthy at different times.
Oh yeah, I look forward to seeing that book. And it when you said constructing beliefs, lots of ideas popped up in my brain there. But one of a study I found really fascinating that I hadn't thought about before is that our sense of meaning and belief can be, when I talk about it with coaching clients, is that it's often about these big goals or these big life purposes. But I found some research which showed that, our sense of meaning in life, this overall broad feeling, can be influenced moment to moment by passive kind of pattern recognition. I don't know if you heard the experiments.
I know that, but I think I would intuitively agree with that. There are different views on what sort of level of belief is important. And the way that I use that word is to mean something as unconscious as the belief that if you drop something, it will fall. That's really how our beliefs are constructed, by developing through our learning processes in the brain and understanding of how the world works. And sometimes those are consciously expressed. If you said, well, what do you believe will happen if you do this? But often they just influence everything we do and think, because that's where they came from, and that's what they're for. They're for influencing our actions.
Thank you so much. And I really look forward to following your work as it evolves, and I'm excited to hear that you've got a book coming out. Where can people find out more about your research at the moment?
You can visit my work website. So I work at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at the University of Cambridge. We're a cognitive neuroscience department that's really interested in what knowing about the brain can tell us about mental health and physical health. And we include kind of neurological conditions and aging, kind of all under this umbrella. So do visit my website at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit, and also look out for my book, which is currently called The Balanced Brain, but I've heard that titles can change.
Fantastic, and I'll hope to be able to share your book when it's released, and I'll put a link to your academic website in the video description. Thanks so much, Camilla.
Thank you.